I seem to be kind of blurry.
Oh,
Peace.
there.
This is Skeptic Haven. Let's talk.
Welcome to Let's Talk, a call-in show on the Skeptic Haven channel. Let's Talk is a safe place for atheists, those questioning or leaving religion, and anyone that wants to ask questions and have respectful discussions. From the US, call us at 984-789-4787. And from outside the US, call in from your computer using the URL on the screen. So I want to say thank you for Skeptic Haven for having us guest host this evening. And yeah, we can get right into it. David, how are you?
Good. Hey, Zeus, how are you?
Good. I'm just coming off of a debate that I had on TikTok that was like a formal organized debate with a bunch of judges and a whole crazy thing. And
So you're still recuperating.
Yeah, I'm still recuperating. Happy to say that I won. So I'm just taking it easy for a couple of days, but yeah. I'm glad to be here tonight. So why don't you tell the audience the topic tonight?
Well, we're going to take it easy tonight, I guess. And we're going to talk about science, what science is, what philosophy is, and to some extent what religion is, and sort of juxtaposing them. My main interest is in trying to get across the idea that there are sort of certain levels of scientific ideas, and that when people criticize theories, scientific theories, on certain grounds, like the idea that this scientific theory is completely devoid of any observational or experimental evidence, that is just nonsensical. Right. So when you understand, the idea of a conjecture or hypothesis, idea, explanation, and theory, these things are very different. And theory is sort of the most important label that you can put on a scientific idea, if you want to say it like that. So that's sort of my interest, but we'll look at what philosophy does. And in my mind, in some sense, philosophy is sort of similar to science, but it's not quite science in some respects, and we can discuss that. Religion, I don't really know how it fits on that spectrum.
Sure. I guess maybe a good place to start is if you were to provide a definition for science, what would that be?
Well, science is a process for getting at the way the world is. So I guess let's talk about the different kinds of levels, if you will, in science. So you can have a hunch. Let's say I would say that's the least sort of involved kind of thing, and then you want to explore that hunch. We might say that something like a hypothesis or maybe a conjecture, that's a sort of a higher level thing. In my mind, hypotheses or conjectures deal with limited aspects of the world, of the real world. We're trying to explain reality ultimately, right, in science. And it's a process, and little by little you develop ideas. I would say that when your idea or your explanation is supported by many different lines of evidence, lots of different kind of experimental or observational data. If you're an astronomer, we're talking about observational data. Then you cross a certain threshold, and then you become a theory. So a theory is the most important thing in science. And so it's a complete non sequitur to say that there's no evidence for a scientific theory, because you can't be a scientific theory unless you have many different kinds of evidence all pointing in the same direction.
Yeah,
So,
just a misuse of the term.
right. So,
Yeah. I would like to add to that because you mentioned you made this kind of somewhat this distinction between philosophy and science, whereas I would say that science is a kind of applied philosophy, that when you engage in that methodology, it is due to having certain philosophical uh, beliefs and uh, uh, concerns that one has adopted to then navigate their understanding of reality. So obviously the literal definition of philosophy is love of wisdom, but philosophy, I think in general, is kind of the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence, and meaning. And so I think in engaging in that study, there are different ways to engage in the study. Science is one of those ways. There are also other forms of knowledge, like
so in philosophy, it's I guess it's not fair to say that it's just an attempt to understand reality by asking good questions. It's also an attempt at finding ways of asking better questions, right?
yeah,
So in that sense, maybe it's sort of very different from science, right? Science is a process by which we try to find what the world is like, what reality is like. And there are aspects of philosophy that are like that, right? We can make philosophy, we can use philosophy to try to get at the way the world is, but we can also, it's also part of philosophy to ask what are good questions to figure out the way the world is. And that's not really something that's part of the scientific process, I would say.
I would say that science is a branch of philosophy. It's a type of philosophy, and then there are other branches which do slightly different things than that. So the way in which science views evidence, or the methodology itself that you've described, all that matters in a context where you've accepted certain philosophical principles. That's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I see science as a little different. I'm not sure if I see it sort of under philosophy. Is it philosophy to say, to have an experimental project behind the ideas that you're building?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think science used to be called natural philosophy back in the day. The way in which I think scientists organize these experiments, right, and how to implement them in the most accurate way, how science understands evidence. All these things are having is the result of taking certain philosophical considerations and saying, okay, this is the way that we think these things should be done. But I agree that there are also other aspects of philosophy that are slightly different, and also concerns that philosophy has that potentially go beyond the scientific project. But I think the two work together as well.
How does philosophy go beyond the scientific
So
project?
for example, I often talk about this idea when discussing with theists, about they'll ask, well, what is your explanation for why there is something rather than nothing? And my response to that is not one based on some experiment. It's one based on a philosophical argument, which is to say, I recognize that linguistically and conceptually, the concept of a complete absolute nothingness is incoherent. That the nothingness is a relative term.
Sure. But so But you're looking for some kind of ultimate idea, some kind of principle, right?
Yeah. I mean, but I think what I'm saying is that we can also arrive at truths through logic, and we can arrive at truths to sort of philosophical arguments that may still be related with science, but maybe be a few steps removed from the norm of what we do in science. So, like I was saying with this example, it's not that I've like run an experiment per se. It's more that I've come to just recognize why certain labels don't actually have linguistic content. So, like, again, talking about origin, my argument is that nothingness is not an expressible concept. That when we use the word nothing, it only really makes sense in a relative context. So if I say like,
but our languages has emerged in a certain context, right? And
sure.
we know only a certain amount about reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems to me that you're anchored to words that are ultimately not designed to get at reality fundamentally.
Yeah, I agree. There's a linguistic barrier there that hopefully and we've talked about this before too, like hopefully
Right.
where it's needed, we can find ways to sort of reframe the language, right?
Right.
I think there
philosophy can't really take us there, or maybe it's philosophy and science together that will take us there.
It has to be philosophy and science together, because I think that is the only way that can be done. I think there are barriers that I don't believe can be overcome, and there are other ones that I think are being recontextualized to create a new picture.
Why do you say there are barriers that cannot be overcome?
Because I think, I guess partially it's because of the way that I view language, as there's always a gap between what's being described and the description, and that I'm not sure, as a matter of principle, that gap can be ultimately resolved. I'm open, I'm agnostic about it, but I tend to lean towards the idea that there are certain, both because of just our psychological limitations and our verbal limitations. I'm not sure. I'm trying to think how to explain it. If we function within a certain context, it's hard for me to imagine being capable of changing that context. And like I was saying with this nothing example, right? Like if I say, there is no food in the fridge, or there's no fuel in the car, there's nothing in there, right? I'm saying it's a relative discussion there, in the sense that, like, I'm comparing two different things. I'm saying relative to this one thing, this other thing is lacking. Nothingness makes sense in that context. But the idea that we could remove all things and have a concept that means anything is what
would be the concept of nothingness, right? We can define it exactly the way you did. We identify the different kinds of objects in reality, and then we imagine removing them one by one until we have whatever's left. Right?
I'm saying there's always conceptually going to be something left, whether it's quantum fields or whether it's particles.
Again, that's your intuition, right? Why does that have to be the case?
Obviously, if somebody can
it's kind of like, physics tells us that it gives us very strange pictures of the world, and it's very hard to imagine, for example, that it could be possible, imagining the stuff of the universe. You create a certain configuration of stuff, and we could end up in a situation, given our theories, given in particular the theory of relativity, in a situation where time disappears.
Mm-hmm.
Now that seems something similar to what you're imagining, very difficult to imagine. You're taking things away, or rather, in this case, you're sort of putting things in a very specific kind of way, and then you find that this concept that you think is there no matter what, that has to be there no matter what, right? There's sort of a clock that ticks by, you can stop things, you can freeze them, you can do whatever you want, but there must be a notion of time. Then the idea that the universe remains forever in a state where nothing happens, right? It's very difficult to wrap your head around the idea that time might not exist at some point, right? But that's a possible picture of the world. And so it seems to me that you should be open to the possibility that there are things that we can't really envision, given the kind of structures that we have, but we can evolve those structures.
I think, well, no, I'm open to the possibility of evolving some of those structures, and I'm open to, and I agree that there are definitely counterintuitive pictures that science provides us that, while counterintuitive, I think are possible to conceptualize and reframe and define. I don't think the concept of nothingness is one of those pictures. I could be wrong, obviously, and I'm open to somebody providing an explanation for what that would mean. But to just say the removal of all things, I don't think that leads to an actual.
Well, I mean, you're just on logical principles, right? When you remove all possible concepts, all objects, physical objects, and all concepts, it's contradictory to then say you have some kind of concept left.
Well, that's why I'm saying that's exactly the point, that you get to this paradox where nothingness seems to still be something. That's what I'm saying, is that, even if I can think of all the things in my room being gone, all I see is white, or all I see is black. Like, there's just nothing in my field of vision.
That's ignoring the principle that you're trying to remove.
Well, I'm saying that
you're removing the concept of blackness or whiteness or whatever it is that.
Yes, but I'm saying that we cannot picture that concept, and so
why do we need to picture things?
Well, if we're going to say, well, because we still should have these principles that we come up with should be able to, one, not lead to paradoxes, and two, be expressible in some coherent way. Like, just the word itself, if it doesn't get to something that can be pictured, I think that's a problem.
Now it seems that there's you're smuggling in a requirement that things need to be, that ideas need to be associated with pictures.
I think that
that's not always possible in science, and we accept certain scientific ideas despite the fact that we really can't picture them. Where we have mathematical structures that involve spaces of different dimensions.
I think what I'm saying is
certain things, and others we can't.
I guess what I'm saying is that if we don't have, and actually, ironically, I think Bree just wrote this in the comments too. I just saw it as I was about to say it, that there is no kind of reference point for this concept of a total nothingness. Now, Bree was referring about it in the context of time. I think for me, time makes more sense to me, how we could reframe our notions of time to create a new picture.
Yeah, but I struggle to see the same thing. Using intuition, right? The idea that there are theories about the world, physical theories about the world, that eliminate time altogether. So this idea of having to cling to time and having to be forced to look at a sequence of events connected through time is not necessarily very fundamental.
If I can't pick, no, I agree with you as far as time. Like, I understand that there may be ways of reframing that. What I'm claiming is that if I can't picture or really conceptually understand what you're describing, then I don't know what the proposition being offered even is. Like, if I, and maybe my limitation, right? Maybe you are able to understand what a complete nothingness is referring to. I don't know what it would even mean to refer to something that is nothing. Like, I just don't understand what the language there is. it seems paradoxical.
I mean, this is a discussion that we had on your show. We're connecting to something we've discussed before, but there are pictures that you can carry with you as you're trying to understand scientific theories, and in some spaces, right, in aspects of my research, I've described not really being able to develop a mental picture of certain things going on near black holes, right? But I can follow mathematical structures, mathematical equations. They'll give me certain things. They'll connect to regions where I now have a picture, and I can use that picture to create other intuitive descriptions of what I have.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's, at some level, as one of your one of the audience members in one of our discussions said, there are instrumental aspects to science.
Sure.
And that's we can still bridge those spaces and get to something reasonable that we can then test scientifically, right? We get conclusions of things, and even though we don't understand all of the details of certain processes, and then we end up predicting things, and we can look at the observations, right? We can do astronomy, right? We can connect, black holes connect to astronomy, to galaxies and beyond, and they have these very strange features at their core.
Mm-hmm.
But then we can create something that's very practical and explore them. Yet I'm still not capable of really giving you a detailed mental picture of what's happening near a black hole.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings up questions about like what it is that we're achieving when we're applying, mathematics and these models in the way. Like, how do we know?
Why do you question the achievements of, if I can predict in great detail what's going to end up very far away from a black hole, and we in fact see that kind of thing, we shouldn't be questioning that kind of achievement. That's
no, it's not the achievement itself I'm questioning. What I'm questioning is what picture is actually emerging, right? It's one thing to say, okay, we are able to instrumentally make these predictions, even create these technologies. And
technology, it's a different kind of thing, right?
I'm sorry?
Technology is a different kind of thing now.
But you want to say that?
You're saying that we have these non-intuitive descriptions, mathematical entities that then lead us to a real technology that works, and so in some sense it shows that the science is working.
Is working, but again, I think actually I did an interview with Kane B on my channel I think a month ago, talking about scientific realism and anti-realism, and under the context of anti-realism, what they view scientific progress to be, where they can say, yeah, we can recognize that there is a kind of evolution to scientific theories, but then I guess the question that remains is, how do we judge whether or not we've actually gotten closer to kind of a correspondence with what science is doing and the way that things actually are. And
I'm not sure I understood that. So they're questioning the progress of science, whether there is real progress.
No. I think they would agree that there is real progress, but I think I think what's been questioned is the degree to which our scientific pictures are corresponding to reality, where, as opposed to kind of having a more refined perspective than what we had earlier. Like we could have a theory that works better than a previous theory, but has it actually gotten closer to
what do you mean when you say that does the scientific theory correspond to reality?
That it is an accurate description of how things really are. So like for example, you would agree that Newtonian physics worked, but wasn't complete, and then came relativity, and it took the previous theory and kind of reframed it in this new context. But it is a different theory, as I understand.
Right, and so it has aspects to it that that don't lend themselves to a mental picture of the world.
Right.
Yet, you agree that this is a deeper description of reality, because ultimately the theory describes more accurately the world, right? Describes everything that Newton's theory described, plus things that Newton's theory doesn't describe, or where there are problems. It resolves issues in Newton's theory, right?
Right.
And yet Newton's theory is more. It's much more amenable to a mental picture of the world.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree and understand what you're saying as far as having to come to terms with the idea that our general intuitions of the world are ultimately most likely incorrect, and some have already been shown to be incorrect. What I'm saying is there needs to be a reframing of our language to where we are still able to communicate concepts to where we can express what this new picture even is. And for me, I'm not satisfied with just saying, well, look at the math. Like, the math works out. That to me doesn't tell me.
No one is. Yeah, I wouldn't be satisfied with that concept either, right? Just look at the math. But when we discussed this previously on this show, actually, right? The idea that you claim that unless we talk about existence within space and time, you're not happy.
Yeah, well, I don't know what you're saying anymore at that point. And if there's a new way of explaining,
I tried to describe to you the idea that there's something deeper behind space, time, and matter. So what is space? We think of space as a collection of all possible positions, right? So I'm closer to that wall. I'm further away from that car. Right. And if somebody says to you, look, I have a deeper picture of what space is, it involves these kinds of connections. Mm-hmm. And so you look at the theory, right? And the theory says that there's a connection here, and that connection is stronger than that other connection. You can see it in the physical theory. And therefore, the stronger connection is what you interpret, what you visualize as closeness in space, whereas the weaker connection is something that you visualize as being further away in space, and that would be a different conception of space. I don't see why you would discard it, because it's not the conception that you're familiar with, and it's also something that we can describe, as I just did, in the words that we are already familiar with. We don't need a new vocabulary for that kind of thing.
I'm not saying to discard it. Like, I'm open to there being evolved concepts relating to these words. I think some of them makes more sense to me, like what you were just describing does make more sense to me than other things that have been said. So I think it just depends on what is being referred to. Like, that makes what you just said makes sense to me. The idea of nothingness doesn't make sense to me. But I did want to ask you. So you were talking about people's misconceptions about scientific theories. Like, one thing that I'm sure we both hate is when we hear religious people say, "Oh, well, evolution is just a theory," or "This is just a theory."
Right. That's not even in the ballpark. That's not something that people should say.
Yeah.
It's a misconception. Yeah.
And I mean, we live in the information age. We live in a time where people have more access to information than ever before in human history. and yet we find the majority of people being completely misinformed about everything.
I'm not sure if that's true. There are, a lot more people are informed. Whether they're informed, whether that information is corresponding to the way things are or not, whether it's accurate or not, is a different thing. But a lot more people are informed, and there's a lot of misinformation, right? So that's.
Let's get back to that in 1 minute. We have a caller, Vandy, him from California. He's an atheist. He wants to discuss about general cosmology and the Big Bang Theory. So yes, if you want to put Vandy through, we are ready to take his call.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah. I'm supposed to be on a different show in 1 hour. Same shameless shill for my Atkinson. Anyway, I wanted to ask. So I'm a physicist. But I'm not a cosmologist. I'm not an astrophysicist. I'm an atomic physicist. But I am supposed to have a conversation with a friend of mine who's skeptical about Big Bang cosmology, and I kind of wanted to ask you some of the questions that I think I'm going to be asked about that, if that would be all right.
Sure.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I guess one of the things would be, how do we know that? How is it that you distinguish empirically a local source from a cosmic source? How do you determine? Can you determine which photons that you're detecting are from which source? I would think no, but like, how do you do it without the analysis being at all circular?
Okay, so first of all, it depends on which part of the electromagnetic spectrum you're talking about, right? So you want to pinpoint the source. If you're dealing with X-rays, so it's a combination of things. But I would say that, astronomy, if you take an astronomy course, you want to understand that there are two basic tools that allow us to understand what the universe is like, basically how things are moving and how far away they are from us. Right. So how far away are things from us? In a sense, it's very simple. You look at objects whose luminosity and there's a long history of how people discovered the luminosity of certain objects and how they know how there's good evidence that those luminosities are sort of standard. And so we have standard candles. And then it's basic geometry, right? The flux of light that you receive varies in a very specific way. And if you know the luminosity of the object, you can figure out its distance, right? And then the tool of the Doppler shift tells you how things are moving. And with basically these two tools, we have a good sense of how big the universe is, what's going on, what kinds of dynamics are going on. So astronomy, in a sense, is very simple. We have these two basic tools that give us enormous information on the way the universe is. And there are also all sorts of subtleties there as well. So I'm not sure if I answered your question to satisfaction.
Well, I was sorry. Go on.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was going to say, like, so specifically in the case of the cosmic microwave background, I have my friend is I think his hypothesis or his model is that this is all local somehow, that there is a cloud of material several light years, parsecs, whatever deep, but still local, that is producing this radiation. And I kind of wanted to know how exactly, from an instrumentalist sort of perspective, how do you rule that out? Do you expect there to be non-uniformity?
Right. So the first thing that I would say is I would imagine that if this is a local effect, you would get larger non-uniformities, right? And so it's a little surprising that you see uniformity by orders of magnitude, right? You have to go 3 orders of magnitude lower before you start to see these inhomogeneities. And so there are people who have attempted this thing, and there are people who claim that this is something that you can do. Is there fine tuning in that kind of explanation, right? That's, you would expect, to first order, you would expect larger non-uniformity. I think that's a fair statement. And so when you look to first order and you don't see them, you see the homogeneity, that sort of tells you that this is a general phenomenon, not a local one. Then there are all sorts of details about the W map, the structures that you see there, the inhomogeneities, the degree of inhomogeneities, and you can make these measurements, right? And that gives you some sense of, given the theory, how these things could have formed, when they could have formed, and so on. But that's what I said.
And I think that honestly, I think that he's going to be mostly on board for that part of it. I think it's the part where you say, given the theory, that's where you sort of like stop, hold on, like how confident are we in these things? And my response has been largely to be like, we're as confident as we are because it's proportional to the success of, in this case, for example, the Big Bang model, specifically nowadays the Lambda CDM model, that allows us to, posit this as the likely explanation. And it does kind of, after that, boil down to, do you have a better one?
Right. So
and I was wondering if that seems too simplistic to you.
No, I agree with that. I mean, so it's a huge collection of data that you need to explain. They all have to be explained together. So if you have a picture, if you want to say that the cosmic microwave background is some local quantity, then you have to explain all sorts of other data. And it's a huge conversation, but it seems to me that
right.
That forces people to let's you have a different picture. Okay, so then let's explain the structures that we observe. Right, low redshift. At late times in the universe, we have certain kinds of structures. Right, the general picture that galaxies form. There's no other reasonable way except inhomogeneities at early times, and gravity dominates, and you form these structures, right? So that picture has to be to first order correct, because there's just no other physics there that you can appeal to. And so you have other things that you need to explain, and they all have to be explained together. What are the we can see what's out there. How much of this element do we have? How much of that element do we have? What does the theoretical picture predict if you look at density and temperature as you change those quantities? And they all have to fit together. And so, that's the thing. You can't have tension with one aspect of a model and then throw the entire model out the window. Yeah. So, for example, when people say things like, is string theory dead? I've never been a fan of string theory to the extent that I understand it. But there are structures within string theory, something called ADS-CFT, which is, in some sense, something that needs to be explained. There are some surprising connections between theories, between quantum physics and general relativity, that you can't just throw away as coincidences, it seems to me. And so even if string theory, for example, is a failed theory, it has identified things that ultimately the deeper theory, the correct theory, needs to explain. And so I view it in sort of that context. So you can't throw the Big Bang out the window, because there's so many things that fit within that picture, and you are ultimately responsible for putting all of that together. And most people who want to eliminate a theory based on some tension here or some tension there don't seem to really recognize that they have to do that.
Yes, I agree. I think the tendency to, appeal to the Hubble tension and be like, therefore we have no idea what's going on. And I'm like, do you understand how much that we have to understand in order to have that problem in the first place? It's a lot.
Yes, I mean, the fact that we have the Hubble tension doesn't eliminate the Big Bang model, right? But it does. There's something there that needs to be figured out.
Yeah. So when it comes to like the bottom rung of not the bottom rung, but I guess like the part of the rung with Cepheid variable stars of the cosmic distance ladder, right?
Yep.
How do we have how much data is that based on? I was trying to look this up, and it was like hard for me to like find it specifically.
How do we know that Cepheid variables are good standard candles?
Yeah, and then using them, how dense is the coverage over the interval that we're using them as standard candles in?
Right. So we look for standard candles, and Cepheid variables will get us a certain distance, but they're not going to get us. We're not going to get to do cosmology.
Supernova. Type 1a, I have data for that, and it's amazing.
Right. It's the fact that these objects seem to behave. Well, there are different kinds of supernova, right? So, but once you know that you have a certain kind of supernova, then you have a standard candle, and that's impressive, right? That gets you across the universe to make these measurements. Ultimately, the dark energy picture emerges from using supernova as standard candles. Cepheid variables are standard candles of a different kind, and so. But that's just a lesson of astronomy. You look for these objects whose luminosity and once you can detect them, and you want to detect them, if you want to do cosmology, you want to detect them in that direction of the sky and in completely opposite direction of the sky, and see these kinds of things. And so the thing that I always point out, instead of going into the details about the expansion of the universe, which is ultimately what I refer to as the Big Bang model, is this amazing coincidence that you can look in opposite directions of the sky. If you look sufficiently far away, you have your objects. You can figure out how what the redshift is, and that they're the same for the same distance. That's an entirely amazing coincidence, right? You want to explain that thing. You need a theory to explain that kind of thing, and the only theory that exists is the theory of general relativity. It's not. You can't appeal to explanations that involve motion in space of objects to explain these kinds of things, and the evidence for that is powerful. And so, if somebody wants to question the expansion of the universe, they have to explain the Hubble data in a completely different way.
Yeah. Their explanation, and I think this is where the conversation, like to some extent, will break down. Their explanation is, at least one part of it, I think, is likely to include, the Hubble data just isn't that good, and I don't know what to do at that point, right?
Well, first of all, the Hubble data is from 1929. Okay.
Yeah, but
we have so much more of data of that kind. Nobody refers to Hubble's original diagram. We have much more detailed data of the same kind. But even if the data isn't great with large uncertainties, there's the simple fact that in opposite directions of the sky for equal distances, you have the same redshift. That's an utterly within the arrows. That's an utterly amazing thing. The fact that even within the uncertainties, the further away you go, the greater the redshift, the greater the speed. If you're thinking in terms of the way Hubble thought about this, the greater the speed. That's an entirely amazing thing. You can't explain that in any other way without expansion. You can't do that because ideas, explanations in terms of things moving in space away from you just cannot possibly behave in that way unless you have some kind of, cosmic engineer that's pushing things that are further away on spheres, and those spheres, the larger the radius of the spheres, the faster the cosmic engineer is pushing these things away. The coincidence of these things is just utterly something that you have to take into account. And so you can't dismiss it like that. You can't say the Hubble data isn't great, right? It's not like the uncertainty gets you. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, well, not with that attitude, you can't. But I believe in people.
Right, so you have to appeal to good faith. And look, this is amazing data. Yeah, but your idea that they have to explain all of this in a completely different way, that's a tall order, and that's what they have to do.
Yeah. And then the conversation becomes one about port metaphor and beyond reasonable doubt, and I'm like, okay, well, we're just not talking about the same thing at that point.
Look, I try to leave things as simple as possible and focus on very little things, like very little data. I had a discussion with a flat earther a couple of years ago, and basically he was questioning just basic gravity. So I said, well, we can do certain experiments, like we can drop this thing, and if I can predict where this thing will be at different moments in time, you should be impressed by that, right? And so, these two objects, this one's much heavier than that one. Which one's going to fall first? And his intuition was, well, the heavier one will hit the ground. The more massive one will hit the ground first, and we can do the experiment, right? And so you start to see that certain pictures aren't the way he's thinking. His thinking is not correct, and you can correct that. And I got him to sort of say, this is interesting. And the next thing that I was going to do was to bring in one of those little toy trains that shoots little balls straight up as they move, and the ball goes up, and of course the ball comes right back into the same place. And that goes against the flat Earth idea that airplanes have to go up and go faster than the Earth in order to keep up, right? Because they already have that momentum component. So you can show these kinds of things in a very straightforward way, and I've had success, But I try to keep things simple. I don't allow them to sort of get me into all sorts of detailed, strange, abstract corners when there are much more obvious things that they need to deal with.
I have a flat Earth friend, and I've had two conversations with him, and the first one was remarkably successful because I was able to convince him that inside a container you can have a vacuum at the top and not at the bottom, because if stuff's cold enough it won't bounce up high, and he followed that. But then we had a conversation about the location of Polaris, and the three-dimensional sort of spatial aspect of it did not seem to go very well. It was rough. Anyway, thank you very much for answering my questions.
Thank you for the call.
Yeah, thank you so much for the call. So before we move on to the next call in the conversation, remember to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. And also check out the other shows on Skeptic Haven channel. On Thursday nights at the Sunny Spot with Sunny Shell. Saturdays at the Global Atheists and Women Atheists Unload with lots of great hosts. And Sundays at Let's Talk. I also want to mention that there is a MythMass fundraiser coming up on the 15th and the 16th. So let's watch a video with a promo talking about that fundraiser.
Dear Santa.
Thank you for visiting us on Patreon to support Skeptic Haven.
Dear Santa, This year I won't have time to play in your reindeer games. Instead, Skeptic Haven is raising money to get a 501c3 charity status. If able, please support us in our goal. The evening of December 15th and 16th will be many guests coming to celebrate Michmas and to raise the money we need. You and the missus are welcome to join us. P.S. Your cookies and eggnog will still be there as usual, but tell Rudolph to not poop on my roof this time. I had a hard time explaining that to my parents, and a harder time getting it off the roof. It better not happen again.
All right. So Wes has a question. What do you think of philosophy of science, and what do you think of ways to confirm different propositions? How would you confirm it true? It seems different criteria is needed for different things. What do you think of that, David? I'm not sure.
I think philosophy of science, I think philosophy is or should be an instrumental part of science. And it is probably, people are starting to, I think, go back to philosophy, given that theoretical physics is kind of at a dead end. I think that's a fair statement. And more people are starting to think in ways that involve philosophy to resolve the issues that we currently have at the forefront of theoretical physics.
What would you? So I was just going to ask a follow-up to that. Is I'm sure you've heard of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. What do you think about that idea?
I don't think it says any. I don't think it says what people. I'm not sure what I mean by people. I think a lot of people get the impression that it's saying something about limitations in our ability to understand the world. I don't think that's the right way to interpret it.
Yeah, I always understood it as expressing some limitation about math. That there is some.
Well, yeah, there is a limitation there about math, right? Certain things that can be proven within your structure, but I don't think, to the extent that I've thought about this, I don't think it translates into limitations in physical theories.
So going back to the previous discussion, we were talking about, I was talking about living in the information age and how so many people are so misinformed. And I guess one question I have for you, given that you're a science educator, is, what do you think are strategies that we could implement to lead to better science education, to where people aren't just reading off of sensationalist articles and saying things that don't actually correspond to the theories?
Better science teachers, better science teaching. I think there's a lot of attempts by science teachers. I mean, I'm in physics, and so I sort of see this at some level in physics. There seems to be there's psychology going on here, and physics teachers, physics professors, in an average sense, there's a lot of trying to get students to put them up on pedestals and worship them or be impressed by them. And that tends to translate into professors making the subject difficult, sufficiently difficult that the students can then say, oh, you're so much smarter than me. I recognize that.
That's weird.
Obviously, this is not the way to go. If students do well, we should be happy. I think that especially in our introductory science classes, science classes for non-majors, we should try to get ideas across that are important in a simple way, not try to make it more difficult. And I think there's some psychology here. We also are not trained. if college professors are not trained to teach, they're trained to do research.
Right.
And that's to some extent changing. There are physics education tracks, but by and large, everyone else ignores what's coming out of physics education. That's changing to some extent, but there's still a long way to go.
I want to address this comment. Theo says, the mind-blowing thing to me is that science just assumes unchanging universal laws of nature, according to which everything runs, and they found so many applicable uses. I'm actually not sure I buy that premise. It may be true that for science to be done, we kind of require this consistency of phenomena. If everything was constantly changing, we wouldn't be able to, I think, derive any kind of picture. But I don't think that science assumes these things have to be that way or that they will always remain that way. We're able to do science because it seems like we just observe that to be the case for as long as it is the case. I don't think it's assuming those things.
There is, first of all, understanding the universe would be much more difficult if the laws of nature changed. But it's not something completely ignored. You'll get a lot of pushback if you propose such an idea. I mean, there is a theory that says the speed of light has changed over time. Now, first of all, is there evidence for this kind of thing? It does solve certain problems, but we need to find evidence for this kind of thing. There are theoretical issues that then need to be resolved. Basic principles like energy conservation. We need to look at them in a sort of different way, different context. So there are theoretical issues with that kind of thing. But ultimately, if you propose such a thing, you need to be able to explain a lot of things with that, and then ultimately we need some experimental evidence that that's the case.
Sure. I also want to point out to everybody listening before we continue or take our next call. Skeptic Haven is looking for volunteers to help behind the scenes. If you would like to be a part of our team, send us an email at info@skeptichaven.com. And if you'd like to help our channel, consider becoming a Patreon by going to patreon.com/skeptichaven. Now, I know we discussed science and the kind of framework that it uses. We discussed philosophy to some degree and how the two relate. I think you're right in the sense that like part of what philosophy does, which maybe science doesn't do as much, is figure out what are the right questions to ask. And I think that may be a point of distinction. And I've said this before, to me, philosophy without science, for the most part, sounds like just speculation, whereas science without philosophy, I think, is blind. The two need to come together to create a coherent picture and to create something that...
Yeah, in a sense, science was so successful in the middle of the 20th century, by the middle of the 20th century, that it's kind of pushed philosophy aside and kept moving forward until it sort of ground to a halt, stopped making progress. And now I think we're looking at, and more and more people, as I said, are starting to think philosophically, more deeply about how to resolve the issues at the forefront of theoretical physics.
When I think of philosophy, I think of looking at everything from a kind of bird's eye view. It's trying to move away from, not necessarily move away, because you look at the narrow as well, but I think it's a way to sort of question what it is that we're even doing in the first place, and question what our methodologies and their success.
Yeah, that's difficult to do because remember, science. There are lots of pressures to produce, to publish results, and you can't always just go out on a limb and say, let's imagine this new idea, right? Because if you're unsuccessful, you don't end up having a career. And so there is a certain conservatism there.
And I was going to actually mention this. One of the concerns I have sometimes with talking with people on the other side of these arguments is that they seem to just say, anytime I can provide a study or a theory that goes against their view, they just chalk it up to, well, it's, you know, a liberal conspiracy, that the scientists are all paid off. This is just a narrative they're trying to push. And you're like, the fact that they're so vaccine deniers, COVID deniers, and who will have no problem accepting pseudoscience to support their ideology, but reject any kind of study because they just think, I think psychologically it's a desire to want to feel like they're special. It's a desire to want to feel like they're in the know and everybody else is confused.
Right, but the thing is, again, when I as I mentioned before about in my conversation with that flat earther, there's some of that sort of motivated him. I suspect that's true to move in that direction, to move with that crowd. But they're not just willing to avoid having a coherent worldview. I wouldn't say that that's the case, right? And so you can make progress by saying, look, let's just do a simple experiment here in the house. Let's drop a marble. Let's put a marble on this little thing and launch it this way. Let's see what your intuitions are. Let's see what instead we get. We can do simple measurements. Instead, we tend to confront these people with too many abstract things, trying to, that doesn't really work.
Yeah, we have to break it down on simple levels. Yeah.
Not because we treat them as if they were stupid. It's because we can make real progress with simple experiments.
I treat them like they're stupid sometimes.
Okay, but we're not going to.
I know
we're not going to have any meeting of the minds in that case. If we can say, look, let's be honest about this. I always say, look, I'm critical about science. Scientists are people, and they have their biases, and they want to push their own ideas. There's nothing surprising about that. Right. And there are pressures in science that push, they make certain new ideas, that make new ideas in general difficult to emerge. All of that is true because scientists are people, but that doesn't mean that when you take a scientific theory, which is, as I described earlier, a strong, well formed scientific object, and just throw it out the window.
Right. One last question for you. So we've talked about science, we've talked about philosophy. Where do you see the role of religion in all of this, and where do you think it has failed? Because the way that I look at it is, religion is an attempt to understand reality. It's also, more than anything, I think, an attempt to navigate fear and anxiety about our reality, that ultimately abandons the most rigorous approach to answering those questions in exchange for both comfort and what one is just grows up being told is the case, or the desire to have some answers where it feels like there are none.
Yeah, ultimately, I think of it as an attempt at describing the world at some level. I don't see good ideas there in general. I'm not an expert on scripture, but from what I've seen, it seems like a collection of statements, and you can then look at those statements and produce some kind of interpretational picture based on those statements. The problem is that there's some degree of incoherence or incompatibility between some of those statements. I mean, some statements overtly conflict with scientific ideas. Like if you have an idea that the Earth is a few thousand years old, that's obviously a problem. So you can, to the extent that you reinterpret statements to then make them compatible with scientific ideas, then there's some kind of project there. I'm not involved in that project. I don't in general see good ideas there.
But what I hate is when religious people try to take credit for scientific discoveries, pretending like their religion predicted those things. Like I speak with Muslims who will talk about one verse that says that the heavens expanded, and they want to say, "Look, this is predicted the Big Bang." It's like,
hey, but that's to deal with that again. I would say look at simple ideas. The word expansion that appears in physics textbooks. It's not just a cosmological phenomenon, right? So an elastic expands. So is this a prediction about elastic bands, right? How do you distinguish the one kind of expansion from the other? Completely different kinds of physical phenomenon. And so it seems to me that that's the kind of thing you want to do, and get us. Because again, I don't think people are willing in general to just have an incoherent worldview.
Yeah, no, I don't think they're trying to do that. I think they just arrive at that and then have cognitive dissonance that allows them to not see the incoherence and the paradoxes in what they're saying. I mean, every religious person that I've talked to will have the same kind of arguments. Will say, well, how do you answer X, Y, or Z? As though
even if there are religious people who are scientists, right? So all of this, they square it, right?
Yeah, but at that point, they'll say, well, what I'm doing when I'm doing science is understanding God's creation, but they're just not applying the same standard to the question of God as they are with everything else. But then you get those people that say, oh, well, how do you explain all these prophecies coming true, as though that's actually a fact? It just,
well, first you have to look at the data and value observation of the world. And, if you think that it's true that people have been abducted by aliens, then we're really not going to have a productive conversation. But you can then talk to people like that and say, look, it's a little strange that the people who supposedly were abducted by aliens, have learned from the aliens only things that we already knew at the time. Right. We never seem to get new information from aliens. That's something that one can point out. Again, it's a simple concept. It seems to me that you can make progress with people. So, that seems to be incoherent.
The last thing I'll say is that, from my view, the main problem I have with religion, other than obviously its toxic, immoral aspects that lead to real social problems, is just the fact that theists can never seem to provide anything that shows their claims to not be purely imaginary. That there's always a better explanation, a naturalistic explanation that can make sense of certain phenomena. Doesn't require the assumptions that they want to make. So, for example, the empty tomb, right? Why would an empty tomb be more likely to be explained by a resurrection rather than maybe there wasn't a tomb to begin with, or maybe the body was stolen, or maybe there was some other.
Well, the concept of a good idea is something that is I'm not sure that you can teach that kind of thing. But if you think that how did we get here tonight to go on the show? That I sort of spend my day at home, that I do some chores, and then I sat down in front of the computer, or that I go on a spaceship around the Earth, which only takes an hour and a half in orbit, and come down and quickly arrives here, which is like they're both compatible with the laws of physics, which is a better explanation. If you think the second one is a better explanation, and you bet money on that, right? And then there's something. You have a problem with the notion of a good idea. I'm not sure that you can really teach that kind of thing.
Right. Well, I think you can if you start teaching critical thinking at a young age, just implement these things that I try to stay hopeful, because otherwise the alternative is too depressing. Yeah, I don't know. But I think we've hit our mark.
Hit our hour, huh? Yeah.
Yeah. I want to thank everybody for having joined us tonight. I want to recognize our Patreons and remind you, the audience listening, that you can become one too, and we appreciate your support. Nadia says they're going to take over the country and mass imprison and do terrible things to certain minorities while holding them captive. There's no getting along with them that can be done. I think, again, it depends on which religious group you're referring to, right? Like there are religious people that are extremists and dangerous like that. And then there are those that don't want to cause harm, but just don't realize that the views from religion about hell or sexuality or morality lead to very toxic results in society. And so, yeah, and that's it. Yeah. Okay, so interesting. Okay, thank you, Patreons. Eric Ozols, Rion, Deneen Murphy, Dan D, Michael Wiseman, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Sunny Shell, Aaron Coalson, Phil Calderone, and Amanda McLeod. So thank you for all the Patreons. Thank you, David, for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you, Skeptic Haven, for allowing us and having us on to do this. If you want to support my channel, my YouTube is Axioms on Trial. I'm also CeasetoKnow on TikTok. And I host lives on there on a regular basis, and also trying to put out more YouTube content on a regular basis. So if anybody's interested in coming on my show or have any questions for me, feel free to reach out, both on my TikTok, again, CeasetoKnow on there, and also axiomsontrial@gmail.com. And so, yeah, having said all that, I hope everybody has a good night, and we'll be back soon with another episode.
This is Skeptic Haven. Let's talk.